Imagine sitting in the dark of your own home, watching through a security feed as your own father pries your door open. He brought a realtor to sell my house while I'm still inside. My brother is already slapping orange price tags on my furniture, laughing that I'm a nobody. They didn't know one thing. I'm not just their daughter. I'm their worst nightmare who just stripped them of their inheritance with the click of a button. The notification lit up my phone at 7 a.m. on Christmas Eve, just as I was pouring my first cup of coffee. It was from my father, Robert. 3 short lines that effectively severed my past from my future. Sarah, we've decided to keep dinner intimate this year. Just me, Jackson, and a few close friends. We'll catch up with you after the holidays. I stared at the screen. Intimate. That was his code word. It meant his new girlfriend, the one who was 26, 3 years my junior, was coming over, and he didn't want my presence ruining the mood. My brother Jackson, the golden child who had never worked a day in his life, would be there. I would not. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't even type out a response asking why. The clarity was instant, cold, and absolute. For 29 years, I had been the fixer, the safety net, the one who always showed up. Today, I was the one they didn't need. I set my coffee down and opened my laptop. My hands were steady. I logged into my bank account, bypassed the savings I'd been building for a decade, and initiated a wire transfer. $650,000. The entire balance. The recipient was the county bank holding the foreclosure title on Timberline Ridge, the sprawling, beautiful frozen ranch my brother had tried and failed to buy 3 months ago. Jackson had bragged about it for weeks, claiming it was his destiny, right up until the financing fell through. Surprisingly, banks don't lend $500,000 to unemployed gamblers. I hit send. The screen flashed, transfer complete. 20 minutes later, I was in my truck. I drove right past my childhood home. I saw my father's car in the driveway and the lights on the Christmas tree I had bought for them last year. I didn't tap the brakes. I kept driving, watching the house disappear in my rearview mirror until it was just a small, meaningless speck against the Montana snow. I wasn't going to their dinner. I was going to my ranch. Timberline Ridge wasn't a vacation home. It was a fortress of pine and stone sitting on 600 acres of wilderness. When I pulled up the unplowed driveway, the snow was knee-deep. The house looked like a sleeping animal, dark, cold, and imposing. It was exactly what I needed. I stepped out of the truck, the wind cutting through my coat like a blade. My name is Sarah. I'm 29 years old. And standing there in the biting wind, looking at a deed with only my name on it, was the first time I felt like a real person, not just an extension of my father's ego. I walked into the living room. It smelled of dust and long-standing neglect. Leaning against the stone hearth was a piece of plywood left behind from 3 months ago. Painted in sloppy red letters was, Jackson's Lodge, coming soon. My brother had put it there when he was pre-approved for a loan that never existed. He had claimed the space before paying a dime, already visualizing the parties he would throw. I didn't toss it in the trash. I broke it over my knee. The sound cracked through the empty house like a gunshot. I threw the splintered wood into the fireplace and lit the first match. I watched his delusion turn into ash. It was the warmest the house had felt all day. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was probably my father, realizing I wasn't coming to fix the dinner or smooth over the tension with his mistress. It was probably Jackson, asking if I had brought his gifts. I didn't look. I went into the settings and started blocking. My father. My brother. the aunts who only called when they needed a loan. One by one, I silenced them. It wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of hygiene. Then came the hardware. I didn't hire a crew. I climbed the ladder myself. I drilled high-definition cameras into the eaves, angling them to cover the driveway, the porch, and the gate. I swapped out the rusted tumblers on the front door for heavy-duty, commercial-grade deadbolts. I drove the screws in deep, feeling the resistance of the wood. The click of that lock sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It wasn't just metal on metal. It was the sound of a boundary that couldn't be argued with. That night, the wind howled against the windows, trying to get in. But for the first time in my life, the cold stayed outside. I sat on the floor wrapped in a blanket, listening to the absolute silence. It didn't feel lonely. It felt like ownership. They thought they had exiled me to the cold. They didn't realize they had just given me a kingdom. The next morning, I stood in my kitchen as the winter sun streamed across the scarred wooden floorboards. The silence was still heavy, but in the daylight, the gravity of my actions began to settle. I had spent $650,000 in cash. I had liquidated everything, my retirement, my emergency fund, and the escape fund I had started building the day I turned 18. It sounds reckless, but I don't deal in recklessness. I deal in mathematics. My name is Sarah, and I am a forensic accountant. People assume that means I spend my life staring at spreadsheets. In reality, I track stolen blood money for federal agencies. I find the shell companies cartels use to launder assets. I trace the offshore accounts where CEOs bury their bonuses before filing for bankruptcy. I spend my life looking at numbers and seeing the ghosts of greed hiding behind them. Yet, for all my training, I had been blind to the theft happening under my own roof. I opened my laptop on the kitchen counter and pulled up a spreadsheet I had titled Family Expenses. It was a document I had never shown a soul. Line by line, it told the story of 29 years of robbery. There was the $50,000 I loaned Robert when his firm was failing, a loan that became a gift the moment I signed the check. There was the $12,000 for Jackson's medical bills, which I later discovered was actually a settlement for a bar fight he had instigated. Then there was the big one, $200,000. 3 years ago, Jackson had gotten into debt with people who didn't send late notices. They sent men with baseball bats. Robert had called me in a panic, weeping, saying they were going to kill his son. He didn't have the money, so he begged me to save my brother. I did. I liquidated my portfolio. I paid off the debt. I made the problem vanish. And how did they thank me? Robert bought Jackson a new truck a month later. Jackson told the family he had negotiated his way out of trouble. I became invisible again. Buying this ranch wasn't an impulse. It was asset protection. I knew Robert was running out of liquidity. I knew Jackson was gambling again. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for my grandmother's trust, the one fund I had managed to keep legally insulated from them. If I hadn't moved that money into real estate in my own name, Robert would have guilt, bullied, or stolen it from me within 6 months. I looked out the window at the endless white fields. This land wasn't just dirt and snow. It was a vault. I had turned my liquid cash into solid earth, the one thing they couldn't wheedle out of me with a sob story. They might think I bought it to be petty, but I bought it to stop the bleeding. I closed the laptop. The ledger was balanced. Now, I just had to wait for them to realize the bank was closed. 3 weeks of silence followed. It was the heavy, suffocating kind of silence that precedes a storm. I spent those days working remotely, auditing a shell corporation in the Caymans from my living room, watching the snow pile up against the fence line. I knew they were coming. Men like my father don't accept rejection. They treat it as a negotiating tactic. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in the dim light of my laptop screen when the ground vibrated with the rumble of a heavy diesel engine. I didn't get up to look out the window. I didn't need to. I picked up my tablet and tapped the security app. On the screen, a black heavy-duty pickup truck crunched up my driveway. It wasn't my father's sedan. It was a rental. They parked right at the front porch. Robert stepped out first, wearing his business owner coat, the one he wore when he wanted to intimidate a subcontractor. Then came Jackson, looking around with a proprietary smirk, kicking the snow off his boots as if he already owned the place. Finally, a third man emerged. Slick hair, cheap suit, holding a clipboard. A realtor. They weren't here to talk. They were here to list the property. I watched the screen, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Robert walked up to the front door. He didn't knock. He didn't ring the bell. He pulled a key out of his pocket, the spare key to my old apartment in Portland. He slid it into the lock. It didn't turn. He frowned, jiggled it, then shoved harder. When the deadbolt didn't budge, he stepped back, looking at the door not with confusion, but with annoyance, as if the house itself were disobeying him. He said something to Jackson. Jackson laughed and pointed to the truck bed. Robert walked back and pulled out a crowbar. It was heavy steel with chipped red paint. I zoomed in on the camera feed. I needed to see his face. I needed to see if he looked angry, or scared, or guilty. But he looked like none of those things. He looked calm. He looked entitled. That was the moment I finally understood the trap I had been living in for nearly 3 decades. This is the trap of normalized cruelty. A stranger breaks into your house because they want your things. A father breaks into your house because he believes you are one of his things. He wasn't attacking the door because he hated me. He was doing it because, in his mind, my boundaries didn't exist. He truly believed that my money, my name, and my home were just extensions of himself. He wasn't committing a crime in his eyes. He was just correcting an error. He was opening a door that had no right to be closed to him. It was a level of dehumanization so deep it looked casual. He wedged the flat end of the crowbar into the seam of the door frame. The sound of splintering would echo through the house, louder and more violent than I had expected. The realtor took a nervous step back, glancing at his clipboard, but he didn't move to stop them. He likely assumed this was just a messy family lockout, the kind of domestic drama he could ignore for a commission. Crunch. Robert put his full weight into it. The heavy-duty screws I had installed groaned, fighting against the leverage, but even the strongest wood has a breaking point. With a final, sickening pop, the frame gave way. The door swung inward, hitting the interior wall with a thud. Robert didn't hesitate. He stepped over the threshold of my home, crowbar still in hand, and wiped his boots on my rug. I sat in the shadows of the kitchen, barely 30 feet away, watching them enter the foyer. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I simply saved the video file on my phone and kept recording, my arm braced against the counter to keep the shot steady. They moved with the cold efficiency of thieves who believe they have a moral right to the loot. Jackson walked over to my couch, the leather sectional I'd bought with my first major performance bonus, and kicked the base of it. "We can probably get $500 for this," he said, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged foyer. He pulled a sheet of neon orange stickers from his pocket, garage sale labels. He peeled one off and slapped it onto the center of my hand-carved coffee table. Robert was already on his phone, pacing the length of my living room. "Yeah, the listing goes live in an hour. Cash offers only. We need a quick close." He paused, surveying my home with a sneer of pure contempt. "Clean it out. Anything personal goes straight in the dumpster. We need this place to look like a blank slate." They weren't just trespassing, they were erasing me. They were stripping the house down to its bones so they could sell the carcass to cover a gambling debt. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt the cold, hard click of a trap springing shut. I looked down at my phone. The security app had a large red button labeled Panic. It wasn't connected to a call center in some distant city. It was wired directly to a silent relay I had established with the county dispatch. I waited until Jackson picked up a ceramic vase my mother had given me, one of the few things I had left of hers, and tossed it carelessly onto a pile of junk. I pressed the button. There was no siren, no bells. There was only light. 8 high-intensity halogen floodlights, mounted along the perimeter of the driveway and the porch, slammed on simultaneously. The sudden brilliance turned the snowy night into a blinding, white noon. Robert flinched, throwing his arm up to shield his eyes. "What the hell?" Through the front window, blue and red strobes cut through the white glare. They didn't come from down the road, they came from the edge of the property line, where they had been waiting in the dark. Sheriff Miller's cruiser roared up the driveway, effectively pinning their rental truck. The sheriff stepped out, his hand resting casually on his belt, his breath pluming in the freezing air. But he wasn't alone. Jasmine stepped out of the passenger side, clutching a thick black binder like a shield. My best friend, my attorney, the only person who knew the full extent of the ledger. Robert recovered quickly. He smoothed his coat, put on his reasonable businessman a smile, and greeted the sheriff like he was the host of a summer barbecue. He began spinning a frantic story about a forced entry and a wellness check, pointing at the broken door and claiming I was unstable. He insisted he was merely protecting family property. Sheriff Miller didn't move. He stared at the splintered wood of the door frame. "That's not a wellness check, Robert," he said flatly. "That's a felony. Family property." Robert argued, his voice rising. "I have trustee rights." "No," I said, finally stepping out of the shadows and into the light of the foyer. "I live here." Robert tried one last desperate gambit, insisting the ranch had been purchased with trust funds, which he believed made him untouchable. Jasmine opened the binder. The metal rings snapped loud in the cold air. "Clause 404, Robert," she said, her voice cutting through his bluster. "Any trustee who commits a felony against trust property is immediately removed and forfeits all remaining interest in the estate." The crowbar in Robert's hand suddenly felt very heavy. The sheriff began listing the charges: burglary, destruction of property, and attempted grand larceny. The crowbar hit the porch floor with a dull metallic clang. "You trapped me," Robert hissed, looking at me with pure hatred. "You set this up." "I didn't trap you," I said quietly. "I just let you be exactly who you are." In a final, pathetic move, he tried to order my arrest, claiming I had stolen the very truck I used to drive here. The sheriff looked at the paperwork Jasmine handed him. "This is a quiet title ruling, Robert," the sheriff said, his face hardening. "Your name was legally removed from all association with her assets last month. Filing a false police report makes 2 felonies tonight." He reached for his handcuffs. As the cruiser pulled away, the lights of the ranch dimmed back to a soft, warm glow. Later, Jasmine and I sat on the porch as the snow began to fall again, silent and clean. My phone buzzed with frantic demands for bail money from the few relatives who hadn't been blocked yet. I didn't answer. I blocked the last of the numbers. I walked down to the end of the drive and locked the heavy iron gate. I wasn't alone. I was finally free.